Don't let the storm steal your focus. These words come from the first chapter of this book by Hannah Reichel, For Such a Time as This, an emergency devotional. Don't let the storm control your emotions. Don't let the storm direct your response. Evil draws power from attention. Evil draws power from fear. Don't give it more power. Hannah's not writing about the weather, of course. She's writing about the slow creep of totalitarianism in the country and how people of faith can, well, stay faithful in such an overwhelming time. Keeping your focus, feelings, and thoughts your own is hard, but it is itself an act of resistance. Be strategic with your attention. Back in early 2025, I experienced a constant pounding pressure headache for about 5 weeks straight. It started, of course, on Inauguration Day. And it's not really all about him, you know. Really, I was fixated on the collapsing legal landscape surrounding our immigrant neighbors, unilateral changes in policy, and the novel legal interpretations that undergirded them. It was shocking to realize that my responsibility, our mission to hold a safe space for our vulnerable neighbors, had suddenly been not only so politicized, but criminalized. And it wasn't just the initial shock. It was the constant, never-ending deluge of new cruelties and new ways of skirting or manipulating the law. Each news item required a refresh of tactics and strategies, both ours and ICE's. And that is how I convinced myself that giving the news all of my attention was a good thing. I felt like I had to, that it was my job to, and that somehow only my fixation on bad news could protect these folks. Sort of a media addiction dressed up in a hero complex. I saw a doctor about it. About 3 weeks in, we sat down for a checkup, and he asked, "Well, has anything been stressful in your life lately?" Oh, how we laughed. My doctor serves a mostly Spanish-speaking clientele, so he didn't need to give me, or for me to give him, the full detailed explanation. He ended up prescribing me some fancy Advil, and I went home to start working on balance in my life. But something I really remember about that time, though, and I don't know if I would have identified it if I hadn't been working here at a church, but I remember how hard it was to find Jesus in the midst of all that. How hard it became to pray. Not the speaking part, but the listening. I could lament all day, of course. I had no shortage of yearnings and sorrows and wishes for what God could do to save the day, to lift us up out of the pit. But it was the response that I was missing. The sound of his voice. Whenever I stopped to listen, the silence was immediately filled with other things. The cruelty, the corruption, the violence, the chaos, my own righteous ranting. It all came rushing in like a flood, knocking me around, roaring in my ears. I couldn't hear Jesus speaking my name. This is not a sermon about totalitarianism, and it isn't even really about weathering the storm. Today, I want to talk about the ways that the storm stays with you even after it's done. And the truth is, there are many more storms than our politics. Perhaps that is what weighs on you today, but perhaps not. Grief is a storm. Loss is a storm. Surviving, struggling to put food on the table is a storm. But like today's gospel passage, though, what I want to talk about is the sun rising on the next day. Now, in the passage that Sarah read for us, the storm is only briefly described. The famous and miraculous feeding of the 5,000, the 5 loaves and 2 fish, that just happened. Jesus sends the disciples ahead, telling them to start crossing the sea without him, while he stays back to wrap things up with the crowds. Did he give them a benediction? More healings? Did he put on Closing Time by Semisonic and hope that everyone would eventually start getting the vibe? I actually love that we don't know. But regardless, Jesus sends the disciples ahead and tells them that he will follow. It's an interesting reversal of who's following, isn't it? A brief moment in the text, but it reads to me as a bit of an experiment, a test run of letting them lead, even if they're still just obeying his instructions. Now, Jesus goes up the mountain to pray, to have some alone time, to center himself. The text tells us that by evening, the disciples' boat was already far from shore, battered by the waves. And just to be clear, this is not a gentle rocking of the tides. The Greek word translated here as battered is translated elsewhere in the Gospel of Matthew as tormented. They aren't just being blown away from land. They're in a bona fide storm on their own. But this is not a story about storms, and the scripture moves on quickly. The sun rises over the Galilean Sea the next morning, and somehow Jesus is walking towards them, treading across the surface, the liminal space where light hits water. All that threatened them, the sea, the depths, the waves, lie still under his feet. Of course the disciples think it's a ghost. I mean, we all know that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but my goodness. Their eyes give them information their brains cannot make sense of. But what their ears tell them is harder to deny. It is the sound of Jesus' voice across the water that lets them know he is here. Imagine spending a night tormented by the rollicking waves, pushing you further and further from where you know your peace is. Imagine the noise, the wind, the crash of water on wood. And then you awake with the sun, and the world is still enough that you can hear your friend's voice coming across the water from an impossible place. It's so surreal, so outside of the bounds of what we think should or could be, never minding the miraculous feeding the day before, that you might just try something impossible yourself. Peter walks on water. Hold that for a moment. He really does walk on water. Regular old Peter, a seeker and a disciple, just like you and me. A guy who knows some things and doesn't know a whole lot more things. He takes a few steps towards Jesus and finds himself walking on the Galilean Sea, traipsing across that same light and water, just like our friend and teacher. So often when we tell this story, we focus on the falling, but breathe it in for a moment. Peter walks on water. The very force of nature that threatened him hours before, it settles beneath his feet. And Peter walks on water. Of course, it's a bit of a Wile E. Coyote moment. Peter notices the wind, remembers last night's terror and vulnerability, and suddenly he starts to sink. When his focus is on Jesus, he can walk on water. When his focus is elsewhere, Peter is at the mercy of that which he dreads. It's a clear day on the Galilean Sea, but Hannah's advice still holds. Don't let the storm steal your focus. Not just the storm you may be sailing through, but also the storms of yesterday, and the storms you worry might come again. Peter notices a strong wind, and with last night's danger fresh on his mind, begins to panic about the storm that may or may not be gathering. He shifts his focus, and the weight of his despair causes him to sink. Father James Martin is a contemporary Jesuit priest whose work I greatly admire. Last Thanksgiving, he put up an essay about despair, which he defines as distinct from fear. Fear is about what's right in front of you. Despair, he writes, is the belief that nothing will ever get better and, in fact, is bound to get worse. Fear is a response to clear and present dangers. Despair tries to predict the future and, according to James, ends up working against Christians in two important ways. First, he says, it denies God's ability to change things in the future. I mean, the central story of our faith, the resurrection, isn't that all about God's ability to pull life out of death, hope out of loss, to change things even when all other evidence suggests we've hit a miserable dead end? And all throughout Scripture, God promises good things to us, promises to stay faithful to us, assures us over and over again that they are pointing us towards the life abundant, if only we can trust them. And James' second point is that the despair denies the reality that God is already doing something right now. Turning so fully to the future, even negatively, takes our focus out of the present and can blind us to the reality of God's immediate presence. The wind gets in our ears, and suddenly Jesus' voice gets a little quieter, a little harder to hear. And the harder it is to hear Jesus, the easier it becomes to just sink. And this is not the only episode in the Gospels when the disciples have to contend with the weight of despair. In so many ways, this story foreshadows the Easter story. Jesus communes with God. The disciples go forth alone and terrified. Jesus finds them in the midst of their panic. They don't recognize him at first. And then faith unlocks an awesome new possibility. From the very beginning, Jesus knows the power of despair and is constantly training the disciples on how to navigate it. Now, releasing despair doesn't mean being ignorant of danger, and it doesn't mean giving zero thought to the future. Earlier in Matthew, Jesus instructs the disciples to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. People who didn't understand may have thought otherwise, but Jesus was no fool. He knew there would be hard times ahead, storms on the horizon, and that the way through required alertness, presence, and wisdom. But neither serpents nor doves get caught up in despair, do they? These creatures don't limit themselves based on what they imagine the future might be. They assess their environments in the present moment and see what's possible. This is the presence of mind and soul that Jesus invites us into. I think this is a big reason why service is such a major component of their journey. Yes, it is good and just in and of itself for them to feed those 5,000. But these acts of service, I believe, carry a dual purpose. They feed the people, but they also train the disciples to see God in the present. I mean, why do you think the greatest commandment specifically asks us to love our neighbor? The only distinguishing characteristic of a neighbor is that they are here in front of you right now. Not an imagined or idealized person, but the one who is present, who is near. And when we turn our love and care and attention to the present, then we can start to see what God is already doing. Then we can start to see God immediately at work. The voice of Jesus calling our name starts to get a little clearer. I know that this was true for me last year. The experience of serving at Tuesday Table brought me into the now, into God's now, every single week, even if just for a moment. Even though this is the very same program about which I was so deeply anxious, the actual act of service on Tuesday cut through the wind and grounded me in a totally different kind of hope. Not the hope that Stephen Miller was going to wake up one day and suddenly see the light. Not the hope that his plans would be dashed by a thoughtful and just court. It is the hope, the faith, really, that God is here right now, calling us across the water, one step at a time. Is there a step that you are afraid to take? Is there an outcome, a possible future that haunts your present? Is there a memory of a past storm still hanging over you, demanding you keep one eye on it? Perhaps something comes to your mind right away, perhaps not. Either way, pray on it, which is to say, give your attention to God. Don't let the storm steal your focus. Be strategic with your attention. Or put differently, be faithful with your attention. Imagine what it would be like to trust God so much you'd step out of the boat. Imagine that storm not above your head, but lying still under your feet. It's okay to be a little scared. Bring that to Jesus too. After all, the best part of the story, as is so often the case when we let God do the telling, comes at the end. Beginning to sink, Peter cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him. Immediately. How? Because even when Peter did lose focus, Jesus never lost focus on him. He was right there, right in front of him, an arm's length away, ready to hear Peter's voice call his name. And it's the same for you.